we're going to get right into it. Kevin Smith promises a rather interesting session. What, are you going to talk about Niagara Falls? Okay, he didn't promise that. So, John Wright from Saskatchewan, Saskatoon by name? Regina? It's close enough. Kelly Isfan from Saskatchewan, but now Norfolk, small town in southwestern Ontario. Is that your second hospital? Third hospital? Fourth hospital? Small hospital specialist. Kevin Smith specializes in everything, running hospitals and fixing them from the greater Hamilton area. I don't think I need to say anything else for these people. Here's the routine. So John is going to get up and give his take on the recent launch and uptake of the indicators at CIHI. Then Kevin, we're going to leave you to last. Then Kelly's going to come up and give her take on how she would use them with a small hospital. Then Kevin will come in and talk about how he uses it at his organizations and some of the organizations you're working with, and also reflecting, I understand, some of the comments of your colleagues. So without further ado, John.
Good morning, everybody. Another beautiful day in downtown Toronto. Kelly and I are from Saskatchewan, and Kevin wants to be, okay? It's a pleasure to be here and to be able to talk to you about a couple of things. One, where we came from, where we're at, and where we're going with the Canadian Hospital Reporting Project, which is, of course, affectionately known as Chirp. And secondly, to talk a little bit about other indicator projects that are underway at CIHI and elsewhere that we're participating in. So let me speak to the Chirp, or again, the Canada Hospital Reporting Project. So on April the 4th, CIHI released this product out to the media. Originally, though, it started out as a bit of a pilot project about 2 years ago. And we had hoped to get maybe 2, maybe 3 provinces on side, test drive the vehicle with the provinces, and then launch it out to the other provinces and get an uptake. Quite frankly, the deputy ministers were extremely enthused with what we had, and they all came on side, including, and this is very important, the province of Quebec. Although last in, it's the first time that Quebec has really opened itself up to being compared to other jurisdictions within the country in this manner. We initially set up a group of experts to help guide us a little bit on the overall direction of the project, and we set up a super users group to ensure that we were going to represent the data in a meaningful manner, but also to promote peer learning, to promote indicator selection, and also benchmarking as we went forward. We also established back in August of 2010 an electronic tool for use by all participants and all acute care facilities that were engaged in this project, such that they could review their data and validate it, and also they were able to drill down to understand the underlying factors affecting their performance. Canadians now have access to a pan-Canadian comparable indicators for acute care facilities throughout the country. And it covers a number of performance areas. These include appropriateness, patient safety, financial measures, and clinical effectiveness. The indicators are available for over 600 acute care facilities across the country, including every province and every territory. They're also all available in French in the public tool. And there's almost 100,000 bits of information that have been collated to present the indicators for all of these facilities. Of the 600 facilities, roughly 60%, or about 360, are smaller facilities throughout this country. And this is, for many of them, the first time that they'll have available data such that they can compare themselves to other jurisdictions. So, for example, the hospital in Davidson, Saskatchewan, can now compare itself to the hospital in Flin Flon, Manitoba, or to the hospital in Wawa, Ontario. Previously, this was not available to them. We also provided a lot of data about the hospital and community characteristics, basically to help Canadians to understand what it's all about. In addition, we have articulated the confidence levels associated with the indicators. Methodological limitations were spelt out, and we held a technical briefing for the press, not that it helped, but we did have a technical briefing for the press to say what the limitations of the data are and to say you can't do this or you shouldn't do that. Sometimes people, well, anyways, it was fun. Now, we have been taken a little bit off stride on this for a whole series of reasons. Within the first 4 days, there were over 80,000 hits on our website specifically for this tool. We never expected this sort of response. Quite frankly, there was media coverage all across the country. Some, like the Toronto Star, not terrific. Some, like the Ottawa Citizen and the editorial there, absolutely terrific. So it was a mixed grill across the country, but we were inundated with requests to do interviews and requests to talk about the project, again, from all across the country. Interest, again, continues to be extremely high in this, and we continue to have a series of individuals and others tapping into the website and taking a look at the tools and so on. Basically, on balance, the Canadian public has responded extremely positively to this. The research community, the feedback that I've gotten has been positive. I've spoken with 7 deputy ministers of health from across the country, which again has been quite positive on this. I've talked with a number of CEOs and VPs, and again, on balance, they've been positive. And certainly, I've also had the fortune to run into a couple of politicians who have received this positively. Now, I say on balance because there's always burps and there's always gurgles, and we certainly recognize that at CIHI. And one of the keys for us will be to work out those burps and to work out those gurgles. The Chirp project, or product, provides more opportunity really for everybody to focus on indicators that are important to your patients and your facility, and such that where you can share best practices, which is extremely important with others, or to learn from others. So where are we going with Chirp? It was once said that perfection is attained by slow degrees. It requires the hand of time. And clearly that is the case with Chirp. It's not perfect, not even close. When we implemented it, there were errors made, okay? We could do better. And quite frankly, as we move forward, and that's the important thing from my perspective, is that we do better. We can improve the tool, make it a little bit simpler, in my view, for the public, because it is quite complex. Maybe there's too many indicators that are there. Maybe they're not the correct indicators. We can tune up on the methodology on some. I think Kevin's institution picked up on a little data issue, which I think was very, very welcomed. And so we'll have to be changing some of the methodological approaches on this. And for some folks are looking for greater depth even still in terms of it. To this end, I asked for a lessons learned exercise, and we've consulted a very handsome and charming outside consultant, many of you may know him, Neil Stewart, to take a look at and to interview roughly 20 to 30 people here in Ontario, and we're interviewing as well roughly 30 people from across the country on this lessons learned. How can we do better? What went right? What went wrong? What went wrong with the tools? What went wrong with the indicators or methodologies? How can we improve on this? Why? Because in a way, the genie is out of the bottle, and I'm not able to stuff that genie back in. So we just need to improve this and to try to move along, as I said, to achieve that perfection, if it's at all possible, which it probably isn't in the final analysis. We're also taking a look at new indicators for possible inclusion in the product. One is patient experience, and we've been working with the health quality councils and several of the provinces, including Ontario, who have asked us to develop a common patient experience indicators for acute care facilities across this country. We're also taking a look at patient safety and trying to add more to that, infections and adverse events down the road. And maybe down the road as well, productivity and efficiency measures, although that is down the road, certainly. We're working with Accreditation Canada, certainly with CPSI and others, trying to build up what are the appropriate indicators around patient safety to include. Let me turn to away from Chirp here and just talk about some of the other indicator projects that you may be aware of, maybe you're not, across this country. The first one is called affectionately Indicator Chaos. I'm not sure if, and maybe we all have, contributed to a little bit of this chaos that's out there. Back in the fall of 2011, the Saskatchewan Health Quality Council got all the quality councils from across the country, Ben Chan was there, and others, to talk about indicator chaos. And the very fact that there are probably way too many indicators. In the words of some, they're uncoordinated, they're redundant, they're repetitive, and they're counterproductive. Some would call them mind-numbing and endless, and basically meaningless and distracting. There is chaos out there. And we've been working with the quality councils and others to see if we can bring a sense of commonality to this. You know, in CIHI itself, we have over 1,000 different indicators. This is craziness, okay? We need, as a country, to bring some sense to all of this. We're also working with the Collaboration for Excellence in Health Quality, and that's a consortium of about 12 of the academic health science centers from across the country looking to establish not only a dashboard for themselves that are very particular, a number of indicators, 16 in total, indicators specifically for them, but also to be able to share best practices. We're also working with the Western CEOs, developing regional dashboards that are particular to regional health authorities. And hopefully we can migrate that over to Atlantic Canada and potentially the LHINs if they're interested. And finally, on other indicators, if you haven't taken an opportunity to glance through the Health Council of Canada's report on indicators, I'd encourage you to do so. It's a very interesting approach, and there certainly is a demand out there at the political level for national indicators that can tie into OECD indicators, provincial indicators, and regional health indicators as a package. So we're taking a look at that in a very serious way, and we'll see what comes out of that. So just wrapping up here, I want to say first and foremost, thanks for the opportunity. The work on Chirp is very, very very much part of our mandate at CIHI. And quite frankly, there is incredible demand for this information out there. And demand from the public, demand from politicians, demand from health departments, and demand from managers in the system. We want to work extremely closely and cooperatively with one and all to attain that perfection by slow degrees. And of course, through the hand of time. Your feedback, comments, criticisms, suggestions are more than welcome. I'm pretty easy to reach by telephone or email or any of my staff. We'd really, really, really welcome your comments on this. We know it's not perfect. We want to move along on it, and so on. So let me pass it over to, I think, Kelly, and then Kevin, please.
Hi, good morning. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my own personal journey with indicators. Norfolk General is a community hospital. We're 106 beds, so we're not a large community hospital, and we're not one of Ontario's small hospitals either. So I think a lot of the indicators, particularly the clinical ones, were very useful. On the financial side, we had to pay a lot of attention to financial indicators. So I think, you know, most hospitals, even our size, have been benchmarking and slicing and dicing indicators in a number of ways. So on the financial side, not as useful as I think some of the clinical indicators, particularly things like mortality after major surgery. We at our hospital may have not thought to look at that particular indicator. I use that as an example because that's good data that makes you ask more questions. And I think I learned a long time ago that all good data does is make you ask more questions about why that is. So that one in particular, we said, oh, our mortality is higher than we thought, and it's higher compared to our peers. Why would that be? And when you drill down, you get some interesting answers to your questions. So with a hospital with 4 surgeons, as the CEO, I'm fairly new there, but you think you can get your arms around by walking around, talking to folks, you get pretty good answers, you have a good picture of what's going on. But with this particular indicator, I wouldn't have figured out that our mortality rate was tied to one particular surgical procedure, tied to one particular surgeon who over time crept into doing something that perhaps he likes to do, but maybe we shouldn't be doing. So, and that's the balance in a smaller community between access and quality. And sometimes there's a trade-off, and it's just a good conversation. So now we're going to be looking at this particular procedure and having that very easy and natural conversation that you tend to have with surgeons when you think they shouldn't be doing something anymore. So I'm really looking forward to that. But I think in particular that's a good example, and I'm sure it's not only happening at my hospital, but many others, where good data that maybe you wouldn't have looked at in that particular way, and slow down and ask questions about why that is. I thank you for that, John. And I think for many of us, these data, the most particular key ones, are another good jumping off point for us to have a conversation and a dialogue with our community, particularly around the clinical indicators. And, you know, I looked at how we can be communicating. I looked at hospitals for some examples. And I think the people that do the best job, you know, on their websites have a very thoughtful presentation around here's where we're worse, here's where we're better, here's why, here's what our analysis says, and here's what we're going to do. So I'm going to take that as my personal example, rather than some hospitals that kind of restate the 3 indicators, the 6 indicators, without a lot of analysis, which I don't think is particularly all that helpful. I think there are issues with public reporting, and I've had a chat with many of my small hospital colleagues. My heart is in rural healthcare, and I sat with the OHA and chaired the Rural and Northern Council for several years. So I'm still pretty plugged in there, and the biggest stir in that particular group was around the public reporting. Because the data for small volume hospitals, the confidence interval is pretty wide. And one of my colleagues said to me, well, comparing to my peers, I know I'm somewhere between horrible and great. I mean, and that's the confidence interval. So the data, for comparison purposes, is problematic. And I think all hospitals, and particularly small ones, are committed to continuous improvement. And really, the smaller you get, the closer you are to the ground. And people know when you're not improving. They don't need to look at data. You're held to account because you're so publicly accessible. So I think sometimes this data gets static in that quality journey and in our dialogue with our community. The local press, I was really pleased. My local press did not pick up on it. I didn't have time to look at the indicators for a couple of weeks, so I was really happy that I know a lot of my colleagues, you know, the local press was very interested right away. And that's difficult when there are issues and issues with the confidence interval, issues with the data. I think in smaller communities, you have to remember, your public owns you in a way that they don't here or in Ottawa. Local donors have built that hospital. Mothers and fathers worked there, died there, funded it, and it's really hard to have a conversation because all these data are so valuable. Higher, lower means better, worse. And that's a difficult thing to have, and I think for smaller volumes, there still needs to be a dialogue between that section of hospitals and CHI around a better use of that, of all those data. I want to hear John later to comment on the administrative expense issue, because one thing I've heard from colleagues at OHA is that Ontario hospitals look more expensive. The apples and oranges comparison with health regions and what's rolled into hospital revenues versus expenses in those other provinces. So I think, you know, in Ontario we take it as a given that we're all full of chock-a-block full of administrators that are too high to pay. So that's probably what's contributing to our higher administrative expenses. I was really interested, taking it as a given, that our local communities in our local smaller markets are very invested and you get a rougher ride. So I looked the other day at a series of clippings. I thought, well, I'll look at the Winnipeg Free Press and the Calgary Herald. I'll look at the smaller market papers and I'll see how local folks commented on these articles. And I like to read, for instance, the Global Mail. Those of us that do, I think we all know you should never read the comments. Because your faith in humanity is sorely tested on the days that you look at the comments. And, you know, it bore out in this instant, too, because no matter what size your market was, whether you're Calgary, Vancouver, or Dryden, or some other small market, the local people that made the comments were all about, they just want to talk about their experience in their hospital, how dirty it was, or how they lost their tests. So regardless of what the Kai-Hai article was, it was all just a forum to vent about your own local hospital. So, you know, what I take from that is politics, all politics is local and all healthcare is local. No matter whether you're getting a pan-Canadian look at comparisons or not. And one thing I found particularly heartening, for small hospitals, the Calgary Herald reported on Kai-Hai data. And data confirmed that small hospitals like Vermilion were the least efficient. shock for me because, you know, when you provide access to small numbers of people, you are going to be efficient. But in this case, it did get politicians and everyone else talking about what services should roll in to make those small centers more viable and support those communities. And I thought, well, if you get nothing else out of this data, as someone who's passionate about how care is delivered and what access is like in smaller communities, that really did the job for me. So that sums up my comments today, and I'll be looking forward to what they have to say.
I apologize, I'm hacking and sputtering a bit. For those of you whose hand I shook, I hope you were washing your hands afterwards. I'm going to just make sure I figure out how to work the presentation. So this has been an interesting process for me. John said that he had mostly positive feedback. I'm afraid I'm the control group. I called around Ontario, and lots of criticisms, lots of concern. But the good news was the light at the end of the tunnel. How do we make it better, and how do we go from here? And first and foremost, the media reaction in Hamilton and Toronto and greater areas such as this, very simplistic in the sense of this is good or bad. And the comparability obviously challenging. So as I started reading more of these and thought about this after Anton asked us to be here, in some ways I asked myself the question, what's the value proposition of CIHI? And I have a new question. I think the value question, there are two possibilities. One is that it's a data partner for process improvement, for quality improvement. The alternative is that it's an evaluator and advisor to the consumer and funder. And I think in some ways this process may have confused us a little about what's ideal. I don't need to really tell you about the background, when it was released and what happened. Excuse me, in Hamilton, our hospital scored fairly poorly for heart attack and stroke care. We scratched our head, considering that it's one of the leading centers for research and development in heart for decades. So the question was, did we actually not translate our research into practice, or did we see a different patient population? And the good news, obviously, is that there was an unprecedented amount of information on the big issue I think that came forward for many of us in looking at this face validity. So we looked at it and thought, that doesn't intuitively make sense. I can pick on their hospitals. And I have to confess that thinking about some of the large academic science centers, including Avenue and others, it wouldn't occur to me that that wouldn't be a good place to get tertiary cardiac care, or cardiac care in general. And some of the data suggested that was so. It may be right, but I think what it ended up doing was asking people to go back, which is never a bad thing. The first criticism I think that I heard over and over as I called people from across the Ontario institutions was validity just didn't make sense to me, and I wish we could have understood it a bit. I won't bore you with my areas of where and why, but they're in the slides if anybody's interested. Second was the release, and I think CIHI certainly declared what was good and what wasn't so good, but I would say that fairly buried in the document, page 111, page 50, certainly have declared, this is how you should use it and this is how you shouldn't use it. That isn't the way that public release of information is used. We need to think about that a little bit better. So what does Chirp data release and outcomes really give us in terms of opportunity, and what did CIHI establish? Well, the health indicators to commence benchmarking across Canada. Big question mark as we see Ottawa retreating a bit more from the national, provincial interaction of national and. Will that continue to be easy? We are seeing very different models, and will this increasingly challenge when we look at it? Collaboration with hospitals to communicate complex data to the media and the public. I think that's a very important issue we're going to have to come back to. Lead time for interpretation and staff communication, consideration of other hospital specialties, complexities, and the unique role of systems providers. All reasonable stuff, but I don't think we hit the mark on the first time out. As a matter of fact, I would say, what did this model do? Well, I think it did establish health indicators to commence benchmarking across Canada. I would say weren't great. And I warned John in advance this was Ontario's critique of opportunities for improvement. I know that he knows that this is meant to be constructively critical. But I think if we went back and said, how would we do this differently? The collaboration piece could have been very different. The lead time could have been very different. Consideration of services complexity and comparison could have been quite different. Harmonization and quality improvement programs. One of the issues that I struggle with, and I had to defend this in my own organization, and I do still feel it strongly, but back to the face validity piece. When I saw HSMR as an example, when I went out and tried to fight with some of my clinical colleagues, this is standardized, all that should be taken care of. Then I see a 40-point swing within 12 to 24 months in some hospitals. I don't believe that clinical care came that quickly to see a 40-point swing. The perception and reliability of the data when we see that kind of swing, in my view, makes it more questionable in terms of application. So I think we have a lot more work to do. Forgive the very, very, very busy slide. Limitations of the tool, you've heard most of them: not easy to navigate, public not provided with educational materials that were sent to healthcare providers, indicator nomenclature was confusing and misleading, online help to understand numerator and denominator were not available. One of my colleagues was concerned about the ability to print all indicators at once. Kelly's mentioned this, the peer no hospital profile for comparison, so you by comparing like to like. So for example, in Arlene, Joe Brandt came out as the leader in cardiac care, when the intuitive mind would say, well, that's the Hamilton General's role. So a number of issues, I think, around limitations, and that doesn't mean there aren't good things in the tool. I've been asked to, or tried to comment a little bit more on what did I hear criticisms from it. Limitations of the rollout process that I think can be improved. The embargo of the PDF documents were not hospital specific and did not contain certain numbers. The financial and clinically embargoed Excel files were almost impossible to download, my data colleagues tell me. And during the initial go live, the first few days, there was some note that the hospital-specific indicator section, due to the numbers of concurrent users trying to get into the new tool, proved to be too numerous and challenging from a technical perspective. And the online educational material. I mean these as all things that can be fixed or improved. I think the head scratcher for me, and I don't have a good answer to this, John made comment, why did Ontario have such a different reaction to this report than other provinces? And I don't have a really good answer for that one. Excuse me. The other issue I think that I heard consistently and felt in my own organization, the questionable hospital credibility in a model where we couldn't respond to this, including boards. So many boards were scratching their head thinking, I thought we were focused on quality and safety. I thought we were doing better than this. What does this actually mean? And going back and saying, but these very broad confidence intervals, while at St. Joe's Health System, while we said we're average or so on about 7 markers, when they said, yeah, but does average mean we're better or worse? And we said, we don't know. Average and okay with the confidence intervals weren't different. So at the level of board members and consumers, challenging. Decreased staff morale. I'm not suggesting that having data isn't important. I think the challenge is when the data isn't necessarily easily interpreted. And believe it or not, even our colleagues, those who make up institutions, frontline workers, seem to take more information from public media than they do from the organization they work with. A really good job inside of communication, but at the end of the day, frankly, and we've seen this on many occasions, our own staff seem to get more information from the public media than they do from us. Perception is reality, so at the end of the day, if you read that in Arlene, Joe Brandt was the place to go for cardiac care, there's quite a possibility that you might go there. Obviously, the folks at the Hamilton General were not happy about that. I do think in Ontario, to some degree, it put hospitals on the offensive. I'm not sure if that means that we're overly sensitive or the environment in Ontario is different or not, but I think some big issues there that we need to. Kelly's talked about this, so I won't dwell on it, and the statisticians in the audience are much more knowledgeable than I, but consistent feedback around excessive system variation, low volume all said, low volume rates should be interpreted with caution. CIHI stated that very clearly. Small numbers of rare events can significantly alter, but the whole issue of confidence intervals, range of values, above and below a finding, really challenging, and precision, I would say, going forward is something that's really, really important. Again, I'll just beat a dead horse. Broader confidence intervals means questionable validity, particularly the eyes in the So what would we like? Well, certainly transparency, making sure it's more transparent, better ability to compare apples to apples, consistency of indicator release so that there is hospital engagement, hospital input, and education, an optimal time for conversion and clarification, clear explanation implications of sample size, confidence intervals, rare events, valuable measurements adjusted for specific hospital parameters, specialty procedures, system role, consistency with provincial quality improvement strategy reporting and mandates. And my colleagues have mentioned this data soup that we're getting into. How many people are going to measure quality? And how are they going to measure it? And there are so many measures in Ontario now that you may not be able to compare apples and apples. And every organization seems to have different definitions. They're measuring things differently. They're reporting things differently. So at some point, what's the role of a national body in working with provincial bodies? Back to my question around the value proposition. Media education and guidelines, and I know that will never be perfect. I know that'll be challenging. I know the headline writer will see one looks better than the other, ergo, that's what we're going to report. In my view, the above is particularly critical if the state is now going to enter into a patient-based funding model, because we are moving to an allocation model that is very important in terms of examining that. Last comment, if I could, really allows us to look at and question a little bit more. If I can find my last page, because I wrote it down, because I'm taking enough time. Remember what I'm thinking. I guess the question, are there too many organizations focused on too many quality improvement initiatives in different methods, different criteria? What's the role of the national body? What's the role of CIHI in the future? And how does CIHI in the province work with the province of Ontario through a number of quality initiatives and standardize that increasingly? So I know John knows this to be so. I offered these criticisms with the opportunity for improvement, and unfortunately, the CEOs that I called in Ontario weren't nearly as balanced as those across the province. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Kelly, you want to come up? You want to stay there? So we'll take some Q&As, but just as I'm listening to Kevin, I got to tell you, or do you want commentary first? You guys sit down, and John's going to then rip you to shreds, Kevin.
That's quite all right. Remember, I'm sick.
Is this on? Yeah. I just want to make a comment about Kelly and Kevin's. Just with respect to Kevin, yikes, okay? Let me come to Kelly in some of her comments. You know, what our experience is with some of the smaller facilities, it's about capacity and it's about capability. And I'm not talking specifically about Kelly and her crew, but rather across the country. We work with something called the Sparsity Panel out west, which is the northern regional health authorities. They don't have the capability to understand this data. They don't have the capacity. And so we try to work with them to deal with it. Low volumes is a huge issue, okay? And we got to get it right. Just no question about that. Administrative expenses. This is an interesting one. It's collected in a common format. Basically, it's your administrative expenses as a % of your overall corporate structure, okay, the corporate entity. And it's collected commonly across the country. Now, some people have said, well, you can't compare Ontario relative to, and I'll go to the other extreme, Alberta, because they're different structures. Well, okay, I think you can. And you'll see in Alberta, a not surprising result, that it's obviously much lower. Not obviously, but it is lower than most other structures here in Ontario. But if you don't accept that, you should be able to accept two other things, that it's at least collected consistently within Ontario, and that you should be able to compare within relative peer groups, okay? Within relative peer groups, your overall administrative expenses relative to others that you know are part of your peer group, okay? Clearly, you wouldn't want Norfolk comparing itself to UHN in terms of administrative expense. But if you don't accept that, at least what you can do with the administrative expenses is look at your own over time. Look at how you've been doing over the last several years. And so I think it's, from my perspective, it's a very valid indicator from any one of those dimensions, okay? If I can just very quickly speak to some of Kevin's points, and I accept all of this, okay? There's a lot of work that we've got to do on an awful lot of these things. You know, that data was around and has been around since August 2010. I don't think we did a good job letting people know that the data was available, that you could go in, you could take a look at the indicators. We wanted you to evaluate it and so on. We didn't get that message out enough, I think. But it was there. And we do know that there were quite a few, and continue to be quite a few, users accessing that data across the country, in Ontario and in other jurisdictions. Why did Ontario have a different response than the experience I've had relative to other jurisdictions? I think it's called the Toronto Star. Because the Star, quite frankly, started ranking in a significant way. And that, for the better part, there were a lot of comments and a lot of media elsewhere, but it wasn't quite the same and to the same degree. But I don't really know if that's the whole truth to it. There may be other reasons, I don't know, but it was different, in my opinion, relative to elsewhere in the country. Final comment is that Kevin made a comment about HSMR and a 40-point swing. Well, what that is that's data problems, okay? And I can think of one Western Canadian Regional Health Authority whose HSMR was way above 100. They took a look at the data and said, whoa, wait a second, we have a problem here with the data. It was quickly fixed. The CEO happens now to be my board chair, so he's a big fan of HSMR because it came down. There are data problems that are out there. We collectively have to fix these. CI-High can't do it by itself. It's your data. We need you to evaluate it. We need you to look at it. And then help us, and I take it in the spirit of help, what Kevin and Kelly have had to say, to fix this, to move things along. So.
Thank you, John. So I'll go to the audience now, and you will need a mic because this is, the OTN network is picking this up, and of course it'll be on video, so if you have a question, pick the mic, and it looks like John King's first. Oh, John, sorry. And when you go to the mic, stand on the mat because that activates the mic. Thanks, John.
You'll be electrocuted, John.
Is that working? Yeah. Good morning. I'm John King from St. Mike's Hospital. Thank you for coming to my house this morning. I hope you like this building, by the way. I worked in Alberta, Saskatchewan. I feel I can pick on people from Saskatchewan because I worked there. I work in Ontario. I've been in this business probably for 34 years. I think we continue back and forth on indicator reports. We can never be happy with what's the right indicator report. Part of the problem is we're comparing regional health authorities with hospitals. That's why Ontario usually has a problem. I think one thing that Kelly said that's very important today is these reports that come out are very good for an organization themselves to start looking at their own data, start drilling down in their own organization. Once we start doing comparison reports, that's when we run into trouble. And once you make it public, then it becomes a real issue. We have been doing these things for many years, comparing, benchmarking, but the minute it was released publicly, that's when we run into problems. And it doesn't matter how the media can pick it up one way or the other, they will twist the stories. So I don't think, the one thing I have a problem with is that this was a public release without a lot of us being involved in how it was going to come out. And I think you would have had a very different result if you had included many of the facilities beforehand. And John, you have proposed that there were people involved. Many of us were totally caught off guard by this report. And I think you're getting a very, very negative reaction because of that. But I think we should all step back. We like data. We need to do comparisons. And this is all about quality improvement. And we have to do what's best for our patients. So let's not make this really negative. Let's try and improve moving forward. But I think it would be very useful if we could do this together as a team.
Do you want to respond, John or Kevin?
John first, and then I'll make a quick comment.
Let me play a little bit of devil's advocate just for a second. As a result of this public release, now that I have your attention, okay, let's move forward. I agree with you, John. But to be honest with you, we didn't have your attention, not yours. You know, just, there were a lot of users out there utilizing this data, but it never drifted up, okay? I don't know why. You know, it's just the way things are. But a lot of your folks were using this data. They knew that it existed out there, but it didn't drift up for whatever darn reason. I think in part, again, we probably didn't do a good enough job on getting it out to the CEOs, getting it out to the VPs, making them aware that this data is out there. Would you please, please, please validate it? So that's a bit of a defensive reaction to me. The other defensive reaction is we're dealing with 600 hospitals. And you can't design this, no matter how you work at it, John, and I think you're getting at it, is back and forth on this. Well, I don't like this methodology. Well, I don't like this data. Well, I don't like the way you've tweaked it. Again, now that I have your attention, can we try to pull it together? And I think, John, very much so what you're saying is let's move forward. And that's what I'm all about, too. Let's move forward on this.
I don't disagree with that at all. I think it is let's move forward. But I also think that we have to keep coming back and saying, so how and when do we ensure that there is appropriate release? And I'm not suggesting that it is everybody should sign off. I certainly don't want to say, and I heard this and pushed back with a few of my colleagues when I phoned and said, give me your feedback on this issue. We should be posting embarrassing data about our poor performance every time it's true. I completely support that, and we saw throughout a whole number of initiatives in Ontario where what a huge driver that was to improvement. The challenge, I think, is when it's not apples to apples. And I believe if we released in a more partner-oriented way, we would absolutely be able to stand up and say, legitimately, you know what, I am a poor performer and I was part of the process. If you didn't get our attention, I believe, at least in Ontario, and this may be too challenging for a national organization, but maybe we need to think about something like a CEO advisory group for each province. In Alberta, it'll be a very small group, I appreciate. But in Ontario, if you said, you know, there are 3 or 4 hospital leaders who are prepared to work on behalf of the sector or through OHA, I think there are some formats that we could do that wouldn't make you deal with 153 people in Ontario.
No, and you know, look, absolutely. And I just want to point out the CEO from Alberta Health Services is on my board, so I'll be hearing from Chris.
So everybody who did well was on your board.
Yeah, Alberta did well. And we've also got another release coming up where Alberta is doing extremely well. We should have asked for more money from them. But look, absolutely. Again, I just want to emphasize this, Neil Stewart and so on, and maybe you can grab him later if you have additional comments. Neil's sitting up there. He's good looking. This lessons learned exercise for me is extremely important, okay, to get the feedback. And then we're going to digest it next week. Hopefully we'll get a report from Neil about you know, what went on. I'm going to contemplate whether or not we post it on our website, because I am a guy that really believes in transparency, although sometimes I don't want to do that, you know. But I think that's important. So we're going to assess that. And from there, absolutely. And we're going to have to take a look at this from not just CEOs from academic health science centers, but CEOs from everywhere. And there'll have to be different groups, I suspect. And if we're going to be taking a look at, and let me just come back to this again, this Health Council of Canada's national indicators that they're talking about, this is going to be quite an exercise. And I really welcome, again, your ideas and thoughts around this through Neil, please.
Kelly, do you have some comments, especially about posting your horrible results?
Well, I guess it's a new, being younger and hipper than both of these gentlemen,
What?
I guess I understand. I understand that it's a new day.
Maybe younger.
It's a new day and everything, you know, I mean, I guess we still are gnashing our teeth about public dialogue. And I think, you know, we're going to go a long ways, and it's going to take us some years to learn about how to have that public dialogue and how to say, we suck at this particular thing, and here's why, and here's what we're going to do to get better. And I think it's really a threatening thing for a lot of us. And I guess having been raised in Saskatchewan on a farm, all I say is that every time I whined about something, my father slapped me. So I try not to whine too much and complain, and I always assume the problems are just all with me. So I'm refreshed to hear that there's been a lot of criticism on this report.
Who from the audience would like to make some comment? Neil, what is it you're doing? Neil, you're doing something. Could you tell us what you're doing?
So CIHI has just asked me to debrief with a series of hospitals in Ontario. There are actually 2 of us doing this work, and Andre Lalonde, who's a retired CIHI vice president, is doing the interviews with organizations outside Ontario. I've been in touch with. I'm not quite completed the work, but very close, about 30 organizations, mostly hospitals, but also the Ministry of Health, Health, Welfare, just to get their feedback on the tool and the release of the tool. So we'll be providing a debrief.
So, John, I'm just going to reflect a comment you made when we were talking about this, that you really only got feedback from one large hospital CEO, I understand. This audience normally has about 5, 6 hands up right after a presentation. Everybody's sitting here a little bit stunned and don't quite know how to challenge you. This is a complex issue. The only comment I can make is that we as little old Longwoods use analytics all the time. Google Analytics. It's deep, it's helpful, it's scary occasionally. So maybe it's just a matter of time. Maybe people need to get used to it, need to understand it. And I guess, Neil, you're part of that process. And if we can help in any way, we'd be more than pleased to do it. Kevin, what's the stuff you didn't tell us?
Well, not a lot. I think
Oh, no,
maybe there was a different language colored by different CEOs that I talked to and medical leaders. I think, though, that there is another, whether it's anachronistic or not, opportunity in Ontario. Most other provinces don't have a hospital association anymore. But I think that the OHA is a really good resource on this one, and whether there was or wasn't an active outreach. The other piece, and Shalom Globerman's here, so I want to talk about patient involvement. What could have been a very powerful voice in this, and had we got it a little more right, in my opinion, no pun intended, John, we would have also had spokespeople like Shalom's organization saying, here's how patients can interpret this data, and here's how patients shouldn't interpret this data, or consumers. So I think anything we can do in this domain to increasingly involve a consumer representative and a consumer advocacy model, but also someone who can help the consumer understand the complexity of very, very difficult and sometimes convoluted data processes. I think that would be an important future feature of these endeavors.
Yeah, Shalom Globerman, Patients Association of Canada. When I hear the conversation seems to be between healthcare organizations and CIHI, and that's the tradition. That's your normal audience and the normal people that you work with. And I think that the idea that you also have to speak to patients, and obviously you have to speak to the press. I mean, but you talked very little about how this particular report can be read by patients, and I think that Kevin is right. That one of the things that it has to do is be, in many ways, more patient-friendly, so we understand. And you understand when you read it that you should go to the Brant Hospital rather than the Hamilton General if it, in fact, is better for heart care. I mean, that's one of the things that people will take from it, and if that's correct, then sure. But we have to be able to read it, and it's pretty hard. It's pretty hard, and it's not directed to us. So the question is, who are you talking to? Who do you want to talk to is really part of this. Also, the other thing is, what do patients want to know is a question that you're not asking, maybe. And I think that finding out the kinds of things that patients want to know from these kinds of reports is very different. So for example, in IT, patient questions haven't been asked at all. I mean, the 4 things that patients want are access to their records, they want to be able to make appointments online, they want to be able to renew prescriptions, you know, they want to be able to communicate with their physician. Which hospitals provide those services? I mean, that's a piece of data that's not in the report at all. Stuff like that.
Yeah.
Ian is my partner here, and she's going to ask a question too.
Oh, sure.
Go ahead, Ian.
Did you want to respond to Shalom's comment? I'm going to go in a different direction.
Okay, sure. Let me respond very quickly, which is one of our key audiences at CIHI is the public. Okay, it clearly is the public, and patients, public. They are different. Don't get me wrong, but ours is the public. This was released to the public, and it is too complex for the public. Okay, we know that, and hindsight's perfect. Okay, and it is too. It's too. I don't get it. Okay, in some cases. So one of the things that we're going to be doing is doing public focus groups. We're going to get people together and actually sit down and say, okay, what kind of tools do you want? What do you need to know? Well, if we don't consult with them, you know, sorry.
They participate. They don't act as objects of consultation. Focus groups are not a good way to hear what patients have to say. You really have to have them participate in a much more a much more inclusive level than to send out a specialist to go to a focus group and ask a series of rigid questions. Focus groups are not the way to do it, and I think that that's what we are arguing. If you want patient participation, then you have to urge and get patient participation in a real way, not through arm's length consultation in focus groups. So I really urge you to think about other ways of reaching patients and speaking with them.
And Shalom, we may not want that model. I mean, I'll just jump in if I could, John. Maybe that's a model with CIHI that the hospital needs to engage in, right? So I'm not, to be honest with you, I'm not sure that I see CIHI as the ideal interface with the patients we have the privilege of serving. But we need to be having a dialogue with CIHI. How can sponsoring or participating organizations ensure that that's there? And how can CIHI make that part of the expectation?
I have to start somewhere, okay? So I'm going to start with public focus groups because it's a quick way of finding out what's working, what's not working. Perfection takes time, right? So bear with me on getting it right as we move along. And I hear you loud and clear, and but I got to start somewhere. And focus groups do have value, okay? That's a great way to begin a dialogue, just focus groups, and then you can move from there over time. So.
Okay, Ian, go for it.
Hi, my name's Ian Underwood. I'm from the healthcare sector, but currently I'm working in child welfare. I'm part of a three-member commission here in Ontario looking at child welfare. We are working with the child welfare sector and the ministry on this journey. And they're at a much, much earlier stage on this journey. And one thing I found interesting in the comments is, I think Neil Stewart's comments is the first time I heard reference to the ministry and the role of ministry and funder. Again, in the sector in child welfare right now, much smaller sector than healthcare, no vehicles like CIHI or big organizations like OHA or Health Quality Ontario. And I think there's a default assumption on the part of the ministry that this kind of indicator leadership should come from the ministry or be hosted in the ministry and as funder. I'm interested in your just perspectives on what's the role of the ministries across the country as funders in supporting, engaging, interfering and not interfering with the integrity of these kind of processes for performance improvement.
I drew the short straw, so I guess I get to start. I wish I had a great, clear answer for you. I don't. I think part of that is going to be how do we start dovetailing? What's the bandwidth of both the ministry and the field in each province? I'd be more inclined to start with few fixed, meaningful indicators and stick with them for a while as opposed to many, many, many ones that will often change over a number of years. I'm not, like John, I'm not suggesting we'll get it right the first time. I don't know that we'll ever get it right. It'll be evolving as we improve the system or we see the system decline. I think that the ministry, and John will correct me on, I think the deputy ministers are all very involved in CIHI to a degree. Is that
Yes.
fair? Yeah.
Yes.
So I think there is a voice, a consistent voice across the province. My view would be it may be incumbent on the meeting of deputies across the country to come down and say, look, here's something that nationally we're prepared to work with CIHI on. And I know how difficult it is for any group of deputy ministers, pan-Canadian, to agree on anything, let alone a group of complex indicators. We'll be back at, well, where do I look best or where do I look worst to a degree? And then, of course, the political establishment will have to weigh in to agree or not agree. And then we have Quebec. So the challenge will be profound, but I think, in my view, the deputies are probably the place that are the group that has the opportunity to do that, and a vehicle to ask both from the field and from the policymaker, politician, and it can then be reflected at CIHI. And I hope CIHI is pushing them as hard as allegedly they're pushing CIHI.
As I mentioned, I have had the opportunity in the last 4 weeks to have a chat with about 7 of the deputies. We do have deputies on our board. We have the Associate Deputy of Health Canada, the Deputy Minister of Ontario, the Deputy Minister of BC, the Deputy Minister of New Brunswick, and I'm missing a Deputy Minister somewhere. The Chief Statistician is on our board of Canada, and so on and so on. So there's a great interface with the ministries, with CIHI. So they know where we're going. on an ongoing basis. We keep them up to date. There's a special committee of deputy ministers that meets to deal with a couple of our issues of a particular note over the course of the year and so on. So there's a great interface right now. Yeah. No.
How do you get at the challenge of having appropriate engagement on the funder side while sufficiently depoliticizing the indicators so you can create an environment for continuous improvement and not a sense that the indicators are just being held hostage by the funder for decision makings on the funding and political side?
I'm not sure I have a full answer to you. You know, if you go back to the origins of CIHI, a former chief statistician basically said, in my words, data collection across this country on healthcare sucks, okay? And as a consequence, we need something that's independent of the federal government to try to take some of the politics out of it because provinces have no desire to give Statistics Canada health data. CIHI was constructed that way. So how do you get there? We're a creature of history, in part. And you depoliticize it. It's not a political body at all. It operates independently. So I think it's just history in our case. I don't have a magic wand or pixie dust for you.
I'm medicated, so I'll say this. You don't depoliticize it.
Well, it's 9 o'clock. I want to point out that our last event for the year means Watson's coming here. Now, Watson is a farm of computers somewhere in the northeast of the United States. I'm telling them I'm being told that they are bringing Watson here. I don't know whether they're backing up a huge truck or how they're going to do it, but Watson will be here with the chief clinical individual who represents healthcare on the panel. It's going to be one heck of a brainstorm, I think, and you'll be probably invited to ask Watson questions. As you know, Watson hears in natural language and responds in natural language. I'd really like to thank you, John, for setting this up, and Kelly for coming down, and Kevin, appreciate it very much. And thank you for coming to breakfast with the Chiefs.